You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
From your fryer to the table, it's a quick trip for crispy fries. But how about a crosstown delivery? McCain SureCrisp fries are designed to go from fryer to container to carrier to passenger seat across town during rush hour down a shortcut that wasn't all that short to a doorstep before they hit the table. And that first bite, the crispiness speaks for itself. To the last bite, McCain SureCrisp fries. Go the distance. See how far our fries can take your business at surecrisp.com/delivery.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 475th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall with the last episode, we wrapped up our look at what happened with the Arkansas portion of the Federals' Red River campaign, when Frederick Steele made it back to Little Rock safely. Now, with this show, we're going to return our attention to the Louisiana portion of the expedition and see what happened with Nathaniel Banks and David Dixon Porter after the battles at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill.
We're actually going to start off by rewinding the tape to see what happened with David Dixon Porter over on the Red River while Banks was busy getting smacked around by the Confederates at Mansfield on April 8, 1864, and at Pleasant Hill on the 9th. On April 7th, Porter had left Grand Ecore with a much smaller but still powerful flotilla. The slowly dropping water level of the Red was a concern, as was the knowledge that the river ahead was narrow and winding. As he headed Alexandria, Porter once again winnowed down the number of vessels that would proceed upriver. Here, for the final sprint to Shreveport, he chose ships based on their firepower and their shallow draft.
He decided to leave behind Eastport despite the great effort that had been made to get the big ironclad through the shallows at Alexandria and then up the river to this point. But Porter accepted the fact that once past Grand Ecore, Eastport would simply be a liability, since there was little chance she would be able to successfully navigate the tight meanders of the Red and reach Shreveport.
He decided to proceed with Osage and Neosho. The sister ships were the only stern-wheel monitors built during the war. Each was 180 feet long, but needed only 4.5 feet of water to stay afloat. The only ironclad in the force that wasn't a monitor was USS Chillicothe, a hybrid propelled by 2 side wheels and 2 screw propellers. Then Lexington was a veteran of the Yankees' Brownwater Navy. She was a timber-clad side-wheeler requiring 6 feet of water under her keel. Porter also selected several tin-clads, including Fort Hindman. She was 150 feet long and weighed in at 280 tons, but drew only an amazing 2 feet 4 inches of water.
The remainder of the Navy contingent consisted of the tugs Dahlia and William H. Brown and the supply ship Benefit. On the dash upriver to Shreveport, Porter's squadron would guard and herd the Army's transports, numbering about 20 vessels, carrying supplies and about 1,600 of A.J. Smith's 17th Corps troops, commanded by Brigadier General T. Kilby Smith.
Kilby Smith had armed most of the Army's transport vessels with artillery pieces set up on the decks. He had also placed sacks of oats and bales of cotton on the decks, from behind which his infantry could fire in relative safety.
On the morning of April 8th, a day after setting out from Grand Ecore, The transport Iberville ran aground almost immediately on a sandbar, and it took several hours to get her unstuck.
The water level was dropping at a steady rate. As Porter passed north of Grand Ecore and the mouth of Bayou Pierre, he had no way of knowing that the reason the Red was starved for water was because of the Confederates' destruction of the nearby Tones Bayou Dam on March 18th.
After the transport Iberville was finally freed from the sandbar, the rest of April 8th passed uneventfully, as did the 9th, as Porter's little fleet steamed up the narrow, winding river.
Porter saw the road that ran alongside the Red, the one that Banks could have taken on his march toward Shreveport, with fields of corn and herds of cattle upon which the army could have subsisted. Other than a few Confederate cavalrymen, Porter saw little sign of the enemy.
On April 10th, the flotilla reached the mouth of Loggy Bayou, or what Porter believed to be Loggy Bayou. But in truth, the federal maps were incorrect with regard to the position and names of many streams and bayous and other landmarks. And the fact was that Porter didn't know exactly where he was along the Red.
In his book, Naval History of the Civil War, Porter would write that he reached Springfield Landing, his rendezvous point with the Army, within an hour of the appointed time. In his official report, Porter said he reached Loggy Bayou. However, in another book, titled Incidents and Anecdotes, he states he reached the mouth of the Shreveport River, a stream that didn't exist. Since Springfield Landing was some 4 miles west of the Red, we simply don't know just where Porter was when he said he reached the mouth of Loggy Bayou. There's a good chance he may have been anywhere from 2 to 5 miles from that spot. In any case, after scouting about a mile upriver, the Federals ran into an unexpected obstacle.
Porter described it in an April 16th letter to his friend William Tecumseh Sherman. Quote, "When I arrived at Springfield Landing, I found a sight that made me laugh. It was the smartest thing I ever knew the rebels to do. They had gotten that huge steamer, New Falls City, across Red River, 1 mile above Loggy Bayou, 15 feet of her on shore on each side, the boat broken down in the middle, and a sandbar forming below her. An invitation to attend a ball in Shreveport was kindly left stuck up by the rebels, which invitation we were never able to accept."
Well, Porter was working on how to solve the problem posed by the scuttled New Falls City. Kilby Smith landed troops to secure the riverbank, as there were growing numbers of Confederates observing the Federal vessels. The presence of the rebels worried Smith and Porter. The admiral told the general, quote, "Banks has been defeated, or we shouldn't see those men here. If Banks was still advancing, the enemy would keep on the main road to Shreveport."
Porter warned Kilby Smith that if Banks had been defeated, then the two of them should expect the Confederates, quote, "to turn their whole force upon us."
Shortly after this, Captain William Andres of the 14th New York Cavalry rode up with 50 of his troopers and told Porter and Smith of Banks' defeat at Mansfield on April 8th and his retreat to Grand Ecore after Dick Taylor hit him again at Pleasant Hill on the 9th. Andres had verbal orders for Kilby Smith to return to Grand Ecore with the Army transports and his men.
Although Banks hadn't given any indication of what he wished from David Dixon Porter, there was never any question in Porter's mind that he would do anything other than go back downriver with the Army transports.
And Porter and Kilby Smith knew they needed to set off immediately, since, with Banks defeated, it was only a matter of time before the growing numbers of Confederate horsemen on the riverbanks were joined by artillery pieces, with which the rebels would seek to trap and capture or destroy the Union vessels along the narrow, winding river.
There was no two ways about it. Nathaniel Banks' troubles had created a sticky wicket indeed for David Dixon Porter and T. Kilby Smith over on the Red River.
From the time they had passed above Alexandria, the vessels had had to contend with the challenges posed by the narrow and winding river. Now, after having found the scuttled New Falls City blocking their progress, the Federals were wedged bow to stern along a stretch of the Red where the channel was so constricted that the largest vessels couldn't turn around but had to back down the river, stern first, for several miles.
The difficulties associated with this reverse movement over an extended distance caused problems with some of the ship's steerage assemblies and strained the machinery of their power plants. Snags, that is, submerged tree trunks, branches, and root masses, made the backward passage down the channel even more difficult.
Almost immediately, Chillicothe impaled herself on a snag and was unable to move until tugged free by one of the tinclads. After that, patching the hole in the ironclad's hull halted the flotilla for over 2 hours.
Then a transport ran hard aground. By that time, Confederate musket fire was pelting the Union ships without let-up. The ships responded with everything from the field pieces on the decks of the transports to the Monitor's big 11-inch naval guns, but it did little to lessen the incoming musket fire.
On the morning of April 12th, the timber-clad Lexington collided with the transport Rob Roy, spearing the latter's wheelhouse and damaging its smokestacks. Later that day, the flotilla approached Blair's Landing, which was due east of Pleasant Hill and about 45 miles north of Grand Ecore. About 2,500 of Tom Green's Texas cavalrymen had ridden there to Blair's Landing to harass and, if possible, halt the progress of the Yankee ships.
A number of men were wounded as the Federal vessels passed the landing under heavy musket and cannon fire. A few of the ships were damaged by the 4-gun Rebel artillery battery, which was well sighted in concealed positions along the riverbank.
Bringing up the rear of the Federal column were Lexington and the Monitor Osage. Tied along Osage to provide extra motive power was the transport Blackhawk. However, in making the tight turn above the landing, Osage ran aground. Hundreds of the Texas cavalrymen lined the riverbank and used the stationary Osage and Blackhawk for target practice.
The unarmored Blackhawk took such heavy fire that first the 40 soldiers on her deck had to move over to Osage, and then just about everyone else aboard also had to take shelter inside the cramped confines of the Monitor's hull. Later, after examining Blackhawk, Porter would state that, quote, there was not a place 6 inches square not perforated by a bullet.
Porter was fortunate that the other transports had already passed the landing, and that Tom Green's Texas cavalry didn't have more artillery pieces with them, or the situation could have been much worse for the Federals. As it was, it took Lexington, with her 8-inch guns, an hour to silence the pesky rebel cannon. At about the same time, Osage broke free, and as she moved away, one of her 11-inch guns sent a blast of grape shot toward the Confederates who had been tormenting her. And grape shot was the naval equivalent of canister fire, the ammunition that turned a cannon into a giant anti-personnel shotgun. And here the blast was deadly, dealing the rebels a devastating blow as it killed Tom Green.
After running the gauntlet at Blair's Landing, David Dixon Porter kept the column of vessels moving past sunset and into the night. It was a risky decision, with only torches and a bit of moonlight to illuminate the Federals' passage down the narrow and winding river.
Finally, at 1 a.m. on the morning of the 13th, after several of the transports had run aground, Porter called a halt. Thankfully, the grounded ships had broken free fairly easily, but after the voyage was resumed after first light, a supply ship, the John Warner, went aground and was well and truly stuck. Attempts were made throughout the day on the 13th to free John Warner, but they were unsuccessful. During the day, Confederate artillery arrived on the scene and took the Federal ships under fire.
With John Warner having resisted all attempts to free it, and with the rebels showing up in increasing numbers, at dawn on April 14th, the rest of the Federal ships continued downriver, leaving the tin-clad Fort Hindman behind with the immobilized John Warner.
The next day, the 15th, Fort Hindman managed to pull John Warner free, and they both steamed downriver to Grand Ecore, where the Navy had finally linked up once again with the Army.
Stop paying those high retail prices for other optics that underperform. At Tract Optics, we're passionate about creating the best optics for hunting and long-range precision shooting. We know that having the right equipment can make all the difference in your experience. That's why we use the highest quality materials and the latest technology to produce optics that are durable, reliable, and perform exceptionally well in any environment. For more information, visit tractoptics.com. Again, that's tractoptics.com. Upgrade today with Tract Optics.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
David Dixon Porter found that Nathaniel Banks' force at Grand Ecore was filled with angry, complaining soldiers who placed the blame for their failed march on Shreveport squarely on the shoulders of their incompetent commander.
A biting ditty was making its way through the ranks, sung to the tune of When Johnny Comes Marching Home, that included the line, We all skedaddled to Grand Ecore. In addition, many of the soldiers had taken to referring to the commanding general as Mr. Banks, a pointed allusion to his complete lack of military training and their awareness he'd been catapulted to the lofty rank of Major General solely due to his political influence.
From Grand Ecore, Banks sent a message to Ulysses S. Grant. Banks told Grant he had little expectation Steele would provide him with any help, that the Navy had been useless thus far, that the Confederates had been rocked back on their heels and were on the defensive, and that he, Banks, intended to have another go at marching to Shreveport using a different route.
After Banks sent his message off to Grant, he heard from William Tecumseh Sherman, who demanded the return of A.J. Smith and his 17th Corps troops. As you guys will recall, Smith and his men had been loaned to Banks, with the understanding they would be returned to Sherman by April 15th, so that Sherman would have them for the start of his campaign in Georgia, aimed at capturing Atlanta.
Banks had agreed to the deal, but now he simply pulled rank and told A.J. Smith he and his men weren't going back to Sherman anytime soon.
Banks was aware of the grumbling over his handling of the campaign thus far, so, in an effort to deflect blame, he didn't hesitate to throw a few key subordinates under the bus. He fired his chief of staff, Brigadier General Charles Stone, and replaced him with his friend, William Dwight. Banks relieved Albert Lee from command of the cavalry division and also sacked Gold Lace Dudley.
When David Dixon Porter reached Grand Ecore, he visited Banks in his headquarters tent. Porter noted that Banks' accommodations were extremely well appointed for a general on campaign, and that he found Banks wearing a fine robe, velvet cap, and comfortable slippers, and, as was his habit each evening, reading Winfield Scott's 3-volume Treatise on Infantry Tactics.
Banks told Porter that he had won the Battle of Mansfield, or Sabine Crossroads as Banks called it, and that the fighting at Pleasant Hill was just a minor action, part of the Army's withdrawal to Grand Ecore. And why, if the Army had won at Sabine Crossroads, was it necessary to conduct a withdrawal? Well, Banks said, it was because of the lack of water along the line of march.
Porter later said he could hardly believe Banks was, quote, under the delusion that he had won the Battle of Mansfield or Sabine Crossroads, or whatever name that unfortunate affair was known by, end quote. Porter was disgusted with Banks' excuses and said, quote, he should have read Scott's tactics before he went to Sabine Crossroads.
Well, with the water level falling rapidly at Grand Ecore, Porter told Banks that his warships and the Army transports had no choice but to go back downriver to Alexandria. Although Banks had complained to Grant that the Navy so far had been useless, he now seized the chance to declare he couldn't go forward again without naval support, and so the Army would also have to return to Alexandria.
On April 16th, the little fleet started off on its return to Alexandria. However, earlier, the Confederates, knowing the Yankee ships which had steamed upriver would, at some point in time, have to come back downriver, had placed a half-dozen mines in the red below Grand Ecore.
Eastport was leading the column of ships down the channel, and when she struck one of the rebel mines, she quickly took on water and came to rest on the river bottom. Fortunately, the bottom was only a few feet beneath Eastport's keel, so she didn't have far to sink before she came to rest on the soft sand.
Most of the water was pumped out and her guns were removed, but still it wasn't possible to refloat Eastport until the 21st. Although continuing to take on water, she was able to limp downstream another 40 miles. Finally, though, on the 26th, near the town of Montgomery, Eastport hit a snag and was well and truly stuck.
2 of the support vessels and Fort Hindman attempted to wrest Eastport free, but their efforts only worsened the situation. Having received word that the water level at Alexandria was falling alarmingly, Porter realized he couldn't afford to once again spend a lot of time trying to save Eastport. So, on the afternoon of the 26th, he ordered that she be abandoned and blown up.
Fort Hindman and the support vessels that had been attempting to free Eastport and 2 of the other gunboats that had stayed behind to guard them now made their way downstream. But near the mouth of the Cane River, they ran into trouble.
The Confederates had rushed a 4-piece battery to the spot, and its fire sank one of the support vessels. Below decks, when its boiler blew, 100 escaped slaves who were being carried to freedom were scalded to death. The other support vessel was heavily damaged and ran aground and was abandoned by its crew. Fort Hindman and the other tin-clads, one of which had Porter aboard, took varying degrees of damage, but managed to pass through the gauntlet of cannon fire.
Cricket, the tin-clad bearing Porter, was hit 38 times and suffered 25 casualties, half her crew. When a Confederate shell knocked out the entire crew of one of Cricket's guns, Porter took some contrabands who were aboard and showed them how to operate the cannon to keep the rebels' heads down long enough for the tin-clad to escape.
When Porter reached Alexandria, he made an unwelcome discovery. By that time, the water level in the river had fallen a full 6 feet, which meant that now the red was so low that most of his vessels were trapped above the town. Barring some miracle, there was no way they would be able to navigate the chute and get back downriver below Alexandria.
While the Navy was making its way downriver to Alexandria, Nathaniel Banks marched away from Grand Ecore on April 21st, leading his soldiers south, heading for Alexandria.
South of Grand Ecore, the road crossed the Cane River. The channel of the Cane had once been the main course of the Red River, which had since shifted east, where it now flowed down the channel where Porter and the Navy were making their way toward Alexandria.
The courses of the Cane and Red flowed roughly parallel for some 30 miles, forming a large, sprawling island between them, until at the southern tip of the island, at a place called Monette's Ferry, the two streams joined together. For most of the way down the island, the main road followed the twisting course of the Cane River, not the Red.
After leaving Grand Ecore, Banks received the alarming news that the Confederates were moving to cut him off at Monette's Ferry. If Dick Taylor took up a strong position at that point, he could trap Banks' entire column on the island between the Cane and Red Rivers.
Fully realizing the danger he was in, Banks drove his men hard in a race to reach the ferry ahead of the Confederates. There were few streams on the island, and thirst tormented the Federals. Few rest breaks were allowed, as the men were kept marching hour after hour, pushed to the limits of their endurance.
Confederate cavalry felled trees across the road, attempting to slow down the column's progress. Other rebel horsemen harassed the Yankee rear guard. All too aware of their predicament, and the danger they would be in if they lost the race to the ferry, many of the Federals were soon treading a knife edge between maintaining discipline and order and succumbing to panic.
Banks kept them moving even after darkness fell. Finally, to give the rear guard a chance to catch up, the head of the column halted at 2:30 on the morning of the 22nd. It had covered 20 miles in a little over 9 hours.
Half the next day was spent waiting for the rear guard to close up with the rest of the column, but then the march resumed. That evening, the vanguard had just halted and started to set up camp when Banks received word that the Confederates were at the ferry. He ordered Emory to take everyone except the rear guard and continue on through the night to drive off the rebels and secure the ferry crossing.
Emory pressed forward through the darkness, and by 4:30 on the morning of the 23rd had reached the ferry and driven off the Confederate pickets on the near side of the river.
However, as dawn broke, Emory could see that across the river was a high wooded bluff held by a large number of the enemy with artillery. The Confederate position dominated the crossing point. The rebels, 1,600 cavalrymen and 4 batteries of artillery, commanded by Brigadier General Hamilton B., had orders to hold the ferry crossing and not let the Yankees escape.
Emory sent his cavalry troopers off to try to find another way off the southern tip of the island, but they reported that other Confederate detachments had already secured any fords or other crossing points, and so every avenue of escape was blocked.
Things were looking grim for the Federals, but then a new report came in. Some of the Union cavalrymen had approached a slave and asked him about any nearby crossing points over the Cane River. He led them to a spot about 2 miles away where there was a little-known ford that wasn't guarded by the Confederates.
Emory immediately sent a flanking column to cross the Cane at the ford and then loop around behind the Confederates at the ferry site. The flanking column was commanded by Brigadier General Henry Burge.
Burge managed to cross at the ford, make a long, arcing loop to get behind the Confederates, deploy into line of battle with skirmishers out, and then advance and start to approach a wooded ridge all undetected. It was only as the Federals started up the ridge that they encountered B's pickets. Once they drove them off and got up the ridge, the Federals could see the main Confederate position a quarter-mile ahead across an open field, and they could also spy some of their comrades in the distance across the river.
The Federal line of battle moved forward into the field, where a ditch somewhat disordered their lines. When they reached the foot of the wooded ridge where the Confederates were positioned, Burge called a halt to dress his lines and take stock of what lay ahead.
As the rebels hit Burge's troops with musket and cannon fire, Emory, watching from across the river, directed an artillery battery to open fire, then ordered a feint by some of his infantry, as if they were going to force a crossing at the ferry. Well, the artillery fire and the feint by the Union infantry worked. B was forced to divide his attention and his forces between what was going on to his front and to his rear. He then received a message reporting that a large number of Federals were attacking his right flank.
The report was wrong. There were no Federals threatening his flank, but B concluded that the Yankees had the upper hand in this clash and that he better pull out while he could.
While all of that was happening at the ferry crossing, Dick Taylor was back with the Confederates who were harassing the Yankee rear guard. As far as Taylor knew, his plan to trap the enemy on the island was working. But B's retreat left the Federals in possession of the ferry crossing, and as Emory crossed his troops to link up with Burge's force, the road to Alexandria lay open for Nathaniel Banks to make good his escape. By 2 o'clock the next afternoon, April 24th, the last Federals had crossed the river to safety, and Dick Taylor was left frustrated at what might have been. The lead elements of Banks' column reached Alexandria about 24 hours later, on the afternoon of April 25th. Next time, we'll talk about the Federal efforts to come up with some way Porter's vessels might get back down through the chute, despite the low water that threatened to leave them stranded above Alexandria. And once we see if they succeed, then we'll wrap up the Red River story arc.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Civil War in Louisiana by John D. Winters.
We've recommended Winter's book before, but it's been a good while, so we didn't think it would hurt to trot it out once more and bring it to your attention again.
Don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and helping support the podcast in that way, just like Casey S., Eric P., and ESC Jewelry Design have all done recently.
A big thank you to them, and also thanks to Ian B. for his donation.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Tracy and I do hope that you'll join us again next time, when we'll wrap up our discussion of the Red River Campaign. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.